Right, we're just going to move right along now. We've talked about healthy soil, what it is, and just so very briefly, who can tell me what's the fundamental unit of soil function? All of you can tell me all at once. Thank you, well done. So remember that, if you only remember one thing today, the fundamental unit of soil function is the aggregate, and we need to figure out how to get those happening, and which means you need to go out with a spade, dig lots and lots of holes and look at your soil. See how it's working. How are you feeling today, soil? Ah, you're well aggregated, lovely. Right, and if not, what are we going to do about it? And if it's not well aggregated, then there's probably going to be some implications for human health. So let's just quickly go through where we are at health-wise. So this is probably going to be a little depressing to begin with, but it will get better because then we're going to talk about what we can do about it and why it is like it is. So let's just join a few dots here. So looking at a recent article, recently I was looking at an article very old, 300 years ago, causes of death in London in 1705, and not one of the things that we die from today was actually on that list. Well, very few of them were there. There's probably a few people died from a heart attack, but mostly people died from things that we don't suffer from today. So what do we die from today? Cardiovascular disease, cancer and Alzheimer's are actually the three leading causes of death in this country. All of them are nutritionally related. And interestingly, with the Alzheimer's, I heard someone say the other day that if you reach the age of 80 in this country, you've probably got like a 90% chance of having some form or coming down with some form of dementia or Alzheimer's. And then when you look at what happens to people when they go into those dementia hospitals, what they're eating, oh my goodness, it's only going to make it worse. So those three things, the three leading causes of death, are nutritionally related, and 54% of our children now suffer some kind of a chronic illness. Until recently, the leading cause of death in children was leukemia, which is pretty obviously, I believe, linked to chemicals in the food chain. Can anybody tell me what the leading cause of death in children is right at the moment? Leukemia has just been eclipsed by something else that kills more children than leukemia.
Suicide?
No, it's brain cancer. 1 in 2 Americans are going to be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. Cancer is 2 or 3 times, the incidence of cancer is 2 to 3 times higher in rural and regional areas than it is in urban centres. So tell me it's not linked to the chemicals that we're using on food. Look, and look at our kids. All kinds of food allergies, rashes, skin rashes, mental instability, like it is linked to the gut. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the gut microbiome and how that's linked to our food. So there's been a dramatic increase in the incidence of autoimmune disorders in recent years. So that's 3 things that I mentioned: cardiovascular, Alzheimer's and cancer are autoimmune. In other words, your body's not functioning as we would like it to. So all of these things that are on this list are in fact autoimmune disorders, and all of them are increasing. So just in case, I suppose I should just actually quickly go through them for those who are listening. So we've got diabetes, cancer, autism, Alzheimer's, dementia, lupus, multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis. And there are a whole lot of others as well that aren't on that list, Parkinson's and other things. But I've put there that they collectively cost this nation trillions of dollars in health costs, but also there's all the, the anguish and the grief and the disruption to families and people losing their loved ones. So I sympathise. I know I'm probably sounding a bit unsympathetic about this, but it is a tragedy, really. It is a human tragedy. All of the illnesses, none of these things are transmissible. You can't catch multiple sclerosis, for example, from somebody else. All of these things are to do with your body not functioning as it should, and that relates to your gut microbiome not functioning as it should, and that relates to you eating things probably that you shouldn't, and also not eating a whole lot of things that maybe you should. So it's very much diet related. So autoimmune disorders currently affect 1 in 6 Americans, and those numbers are growing daily. At the same rate as our levels of fertility, look at this way, are going down, autoimmune disorders are increasing very rapidly. And especially things like autism, the numbers are going through the roof. I can't remember now what the figure is, but not that far in the future, people are predicting at the rate that autism is increasing, that 1 in 2 children will be born autistic in this country. So more Americans are dying from a poor diet than any other factor, and part of that problem is food choices. Always strikes me, you know, when you go into a supermarket and see what people are actually buying. Sometimes people could spend hundreds of dollars on a cart full of things there isn't any food in there. Like, it's really amazing that you spend all that money on, and probably taking it home to feed children on, and there isn't any food in there. It's what people think is food, but it's not. So that's part of the problem, but then even people who are trying to eat an appropriate diet are often not getting the nutrition in that food. So agriculture is mostly about food, but there is something fundamentally wrong with our food production system. So we would have to, when we analyse food, we find that the nutrient density in current today, so I'm talking about what you can buy in the supermarket, I'm not talking about when you grow it yourself or what you get at the CSA or what you get at the food co-op, or, you know, I'm talking about just if you were to go to the supermarket and select your fruit and vegetables and dairy and meat and everything from there, the nutritional value of that will be lower than it has been at any point in human history. So you'd have to eat twice as much meat, 3 times as much fruit, and 4 to 5 times as many vegetables just to get the same nutrient content in that food as would have been available back in 1940. So there's quite a lot of literature on this. The one I like is this one that's actually from the UK. This is Dr. David Thomas. He did a very detailed study on this. It's been published in the Journal of Nutrition and Health. And he went back through food composition tables in the United Kingdom and compared every year from 1940 to 1991, so that 50-year period. And he analysed 27 different kinds of vegetables and found that the key things that had declined, copper was the biggest one, declined by 76%, calcium declined by 46%, and iron declined by 27%, and so on. But, you know, copper, I was talking this morning about enzymes. What is it that the chemical transformations, the biochemical transformations that need to take place in soil in order for plants to obtain the nutrients that they need require enzymes, and those enzymes are produced by microbes. Every enzyme requires a catalyst. So we need to have an enzyme and we need to have a catalyst. And the catalyst for an enzyme can't work without a catalyst. The catalyst for enzymes are metals, generally. And one of those key metals is copper. So if copper has declined 76% in our diet, then there's a whole lot of enzymic reactions, metabolic processes that need to take place in our bodies in order for us to be fully functional. So if we have an autoimmune disorder, it means that we're not fully functional. If we're not fully functional, it probably means there are some key enzymes that aren't working, because none of the metabolic processes can proceed without an enzyme, and those enzymes require catalysts. If we're not getting things like copper and zinc and selenium and other catalysts in our diet, then the functions just can't take place. So copper is not so much a nutrient as such, but it's a very, very important catalyst. Calcium we know is important for the health of our bones, and a whole lot of other things as well, obviously. And iron is very important for our energy, because haemoglobin, that carries oxygen in your blood, contains iron. So if your iron levels are low, you're probably feeling lethargic, etc., etc. So, you know, these things are all magnesium is involved in that 300 chemical reactions in the body, and particularly for heart function. So in Australia, if you turn up at the hospital with anything at all wrong with your heart, the first thing they'll do is put you on a magnesium drip before they even get your name and address and all those details they want to know when you're lying there dying. It's like, what's your name and address? Oh, can you please help me? But if it's something to do with your heart, they will give you magnesium before they do anything else, because it is so commonly the problem is lack of magnesium. So, yeah. And then if we look at meat, of course, our livestock are consuming plants, grains, whatever, from the same soil as all of our food comes from. Right? This is a soil dysfunction problem that we're talking about. So when we look at mineral depletion in meat, we see the same kinds of things depleted in meat as what was depleted in the fruits and vegetables. Copper, calcium, iron, for example. So iron, we've got there 54% reduction in the amount of iron in meat. So if you were to take the same cut of, if you just use So that was 10 different kinds of meat. But if we were just to take beef, for example, which is very commonly consumed in this country, and you were to take the same cut from the same age of animal, of the same type of animal, let's just say a Hereford steer, 18-month-old Hereford steer grown on exactly the same ranch, but 50 years later, it would have half the amount of iron in that same quantity of meat. So that's really significant, that there's half the amount of iron in something that we consider to be a good source of iron, right, like meat. And then he also looked at dairy products and a whole lot of other things, so I'd recommend those articles to people that were really interested. And there's also been work done in the United States as well. So all countries keep, or all, well, what's the right word for it these days? What's the politically correct word? It's not developed anymore, is it? What countries, first world countries, can I say that? I don't know. Is it really a first world country when so many people are having issues with autoimmune disorders? But anyway, there are food composition tables in this country and you can see what's happened to food here. So the explanations for these things, mainly people acknowledge that nutrient levels have declined in food. Nobody ever disputes that. But they will say there's two causes. One is the dilution effect. The fact that we produce more from the same area of land, which we certainly do for things like grains. Since the so-called green revolution, yields have increased. So people say, well, if you double the yield of something on the same piece of land, it will only have half the amount of nutrients in it. That is commonly given as the reason for why nutrient levels have fallen, and it makes sense. The other one is depletion. Well, if we're producing all this stuff and it's all going out the farm gate, we're taking from the land, so mineral levels are going to fall. So we've got less minerals and trace elements in our plants because we've depleted them. That's another argument that makes sense. Until you actually go back and start doing soil tests, and don't do the ordinary kinds of soil tests where people just look at what's water-soluble phosphorus and what's water-soluble nitrogen. That doesn't tell you anything. But if you take a total soil test, what's the total amount of phosphorus in my soil? What's the total amount of calcium? What's the total amount of copper and zinc and boron and all of these things in my soil? You'll find you have everything that plants need in your soil. Particularly here in New Mexico, in lower rainfall areas, you'll find your soils are incredibly minerally rich. But even in areas, in higher rainfall areas where there's been a lot of production over a long time, there's been a lot of product has actually left the farm gate. What is there in total is huge, because your soil is made of minerals, as we discussed this morning. That's what soil is, right? So all you have to do is actually make those minerals available, which is why we need to talk about microbes. So, and as far as the dilution effect goes, what we see is that in biologically functional soils, if you've got a soil that's really functioning effectively, that as the biological function, if you like, of that soil increases, as it becomes more microbially diverse, as plant diversity increases, as we see more aggregates forming, better water infiltration, all those things that go with healthier soil, we actually see that the nutrient density in the plants increases. So there's a really strong link there between soil function and nutrient density in food. So the dilution's not the problem, and depletion is not the problem. Those things are not the causes of falling nutrient levels in our food. The problem is that plants can no longer acquire the minerals and trace elements that they need. So this morning we talked about, what is healthy soil, what is the fundamental unit of soil function, which is an aggregate, and how does an aggregate form? Well, you have to have microbial activity in order to form aggregates. That means microbes need actively growing green plants. Microbes need actively growing green plants in order to form soil. They also need actively growing green plants in order to produce enzymes to make nutrients available to plants. So it's really all about microbial activity. And indeed, when we look at the major transformations that take place in soil in terms of moving nutrients from the non-available pool into the available pool, like things like phosphorus, nearly all of it is in the non-available pool. There's only a tiny, tiny amount in the available pool. So we have to figure out how do we move it into that available pool. That's going to be microbial activity. And 85 to 90% of all of the nutrients taken up by plants actually have to go through a microbial intermediate. So what we need is more biological activity around our plant roots. So without microbes, plants would actually starve to death. So what we're really talking about when we're talking about healthy soil is what's the biomass of microbes that are there, what kinds of microbes are there, what different functional groups of microbes do we have, because all microbes do different things. Like the ones that fix nitrogen use nitrogenase enzyme, the ones that are going to release phosphorus use phosphatase enzyme, the ones that are going to release zinc are going to use a different kind of enzyme. So every kind of mineral trace element that the plant needs is going to have a conversation with a different kind of microbe and feed that microbe in order to obtain that mineral. So one of the, there's so many things that we could talk about in terms of plant microbes, but in the last 10 years, we've learned an incredible amount. One thing we know is that plants actually farm microbes, they cultivate them, they consume them, and we call that microbivory. So plants are sending out signals to the microbes that they need, but let's say they send out signals to microbes that can access zinc. Well, how are they then going to get that zinc? Well, what happens is they actually have to attract the microbes to the plant roots, engulf them if you like, it's called endocytosis, take them into the plant roots, strip them of their zinc, and then shoot them out again and feed them and say, go get some more zinc. So this is what we call the microbivory cycle. And plants are farming, cultivating microbes all of the time. I also mentioned this morning about microbes that live in the soil, that are invited by the plant to move into the plant. There's a lot of bacteria do that as well as fungi. They're going to live in that plant their entire life. One of those things they will do is like fix nitrogen. So there's all this much more relationship between plants and microbes than we ever realised. There's also a very strong relationship between humans and microbes and animals and microbes, and in fact we all depend on microbes for our survival. Oh, I forgot about those slides. So just without microbes, plant would starve to death, and the very fact that we now have reduced levels of microbial activity in our plants has actually led to back to the first problem that I talked about, all the autoimmune disorders that we now have in the human population has been because the plants now, they don't have the minerals and trace elements that they need. We don't get it in our food, but the plants don't have them either. So their immune systems aren't functioning. They don't have the copper and the zinc and the calcium and all the things that they need. So what happens is that they're now more susceptible to pests and diseases. That means that farmers have to use insecticides and fungicides. Like, who wants to jump on a tractor and go out and spray insecticide? It smells disgusting. Like, it is not a fun thing to do. Fungicides are the same. Horrible chemicals. Farmers don't do that for fun. If you had a choice between going fishing or hunting for the day or getting on a tractor and going out and spraying chemicals, who'd not rather go fishing or hunting or just relaxing or reading a book or, you know what I mean? People don't apply those things unless they have to. So they apply those things because their plants are not able to defend themselves. And so you have to protect them using plant protection chemicals, so they're called. So that's going to cost farmers money, it's going to reduce their profits. We'll talk a little bit later today about how the economics of farming are linked to soil health. Sorry, I've just got something in my throat here. So that's going to reduce farmers' profits because they've always got money going out for all these additional things that have to be used, this high input agriculture. So I'm just going to
make an exception.
Sorry.
She can afford it.
Sorry, I didn't realise that also related to water. We weren't supposed to have water here. All right, so our plants have got compromised immune systems just like we have because they are suffering all the same nutrient deficiencies that we are. And so farmers are put in the situation of having to try and protect their plants from insects and fungal pathogens and things that will only attack sick plants anyway. Healthy plants are not going to have any kind of insect damage on them. Once you get Brix levels over 12, no insect damage, healthy plants are going to be able to protect themselves from fungal pathogens. And healthy plants are also going to be much more tolerant to drought, much more tolerant to frost, much more tolerant to any kind of climatic extremes. So I just looked at like the effect on people of all the chemicals in the food system, the effect on plants of reduced nutrient density, and then why that then results in the addition of more chemicals. And no civilization has actually outlived the health of its citizens. We've seen over centuries, past centuries, where soil health has declined and human health has declined and entire civilizations have been wiped out. Now with the fertility issues that we have, we probably will fail to reproduce before we die. It's going to be a race to see whether we die from all the chemicals we use in ag or whether we just fail to reproduce, because human fertility is now so low. And so no civilization has outlived the usefulness of its soils. I mean, soils are just, they are so fundamentally important, but we do have to understand how they function. So they're not lacking in minerals. They're absolutely full of minerals, that's what they are. They're lacking in microbes, as is the human gut. So it's all about supporting microbes. Doesn't matter which kind of ecosystem we're looking at, that's what the aim is. So the soil microbiome, let's just look at microbes just in some general ways, just very, very quickly. That a recent census of life showed that there is 550 gigatons of carbon-based life forms on Earth, and 450 of that is in the form of plants, which is hardly surprising because almost anywhere you go, the major life form that you will see is plants. But what constitutes the other 100 gigatons? This is where it gets really interesting. So we have 450 of the 550 gigatons is in plants. What makes up the other 100? Well, you know what? It's nearly all things we can't see. 93% of the rest of life on Earth is things that you need a microscope to see. The protists, the archaea, the fungi, the bacteria actually comprise 93%. And if we look at that in a diagrammatic form as a graph, kind of a thing, the protists up there, the orange, archaea purple, fungi green, and then bacteria 70% of that 100 gigatons. It is absolutely incredible. This is the weight, this is the biomass of microbes on the face of this planet. Humans don't even register on that scale. We don't even get a look in. And all of the things that we think of as being life, when you think about life on Earth, you think about the birds and the fish and the wildlife and your livestock and your pets, and as a general rule, that's what most of us think about when we think about life. And all those things only make up 7% of the biomass of life on Earth. And humans, well, we're 0.01% of the biomass of life on Earth. We've done a lot of damage for the fact that there's not that many of us here, really. We have had a huge impact on Earth's ecosystems, but my hope is that we can also have a huge impact in a positive way if we understand what the processes are and where we have to target our energy to restore things. I think we can turn everything around. I'm very hopeful for the future. I think we can turn things around in a very short amount of time. So that is, all of those comparisons are by weight, not by number. Now, if we start looking at numbers of microbes, wow, it's even more, it makes us look even more insignificant, actually. Because 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, and I'm talking about soil now from round plant roots, not just soil anywhere, like those photos I showed you where there's all that life around plant roots, 1 teaspoon of that contains more microbes than there are humans on the planet. So we're up to something like 7 point something or other billion people on the planet. 1 teaspoon of healthy soil will have trillions of microbes if there are rhizospheres. Just a tiny section of one of those rhizospheres on plant roots has trillions. Like, that's an order of magnitude higher than the billions, right, of humans on the planet. And it gets even more staggering than that, I suppose, because 1 drop of rumen fluid, like, the rumen of a sheep or a cow, one tiny drop of that has 10,000 times more microbes than there are humans on the planet. It's very hard for us to get our head around this, and these microbes do absolutely amazing things. When they coordinate their activities, it's extraordinary what they are capable of. There's a lot of communication going on between those microbes, and that's one thing that some of the advances that we're making now in regenerative agriculture is how to figure out what those signals are that microbes use for communication, and we can mimic that signalling, all that signalling that, like I mentioned this morning, that communication that goes on between plants and microbes. We can mimic that in a natural way, using natural products to mimic that, using things like biostimulants to actually enhance all those processes rather than using high analysis fertilisers that are going to interfere with all that communication. And then we have, because the plant now has a compromised immune system, we then have to come in with all insecticides and fungicides. So what happens to us, to people consuming that food, is it's low in nutrients and it's high in chemical residues. So it's very, very hard for our bodies to deal with that, what I call the double whammy. So just going back to microbes again, we have about 1 trillion human cells and 10 trillion bacterial cells in our bodies. So on a cell count, just counting the number of cells in our body, we are about 1% human. We're about 10%, we're 10% human on a cell count. I think there was a book written called 10% Human. I don't know whether anybody here has read that. But then if we look at the genes, if we look at our DNA, we have around 300,000 human genes and 100 times more that in bacterial genes. So from a genetic perspective, we're 1% human. So we tend to forget about how important bacterial DNA is in our bodies and also in plants. So if we just look at plants, some people get a bit upset when I start talking about human, like bacterial DNA that actually, like our mitochondria, are our bacterial DNA. So let's just talk about a plant for a minute. So the two of the important organelles in the plant are the mitochondria, which are the energy centres for every cell, and the chloroplasts, which is where photosynthesis takes place. So the chloroplasts contain, the DNA in a chloroplast is identical to the DNA in blue-green algae, which were the bacteria which millions of years ago transformed the Earth's atmosphere. So, it's very interesting, and the DNA in mitochondria is identical. It's bacterial DNA. So this is one reason why bacteria in the soil and bacteria in our gut are able to have this communication with our bodies and with plant bodies and with animal bodies, because the DNA is identical and they're able to talk to each other. So in plants, it's the same as it is in animals and humans. There are more microbial cells on and in plants than there are plant cells. So when you look at a plant, just remember you're looking at something that's absolutely covered in microbes and absolutely full of microbes. And it's the microbes in and on those plants that are going to communicate with microbes in the soil. We have to look at everything as being an assemblage of microbes. We are microbe taxis. Our plants are microbe taxis. Microbes are running this planet, and they really are, and we have to figure out how to work with them because they're very clever in doing that, and they do it extremely well. So the natural world is composed of interdependent communities of organisms. So that's the other thing too. It's not species acting on their own. We always want to identify everything and, what species have I got in here? It's communities. It's how all the different functional groups react and work together to make the whole. Just like I was saying, we have heart, liver, lungs, spleen, kidneys, etc. If you start taking things out, I'll just pull your liver out and just pull your heart out. I mean, really, you don't work that well. So how do we think our soil is going to work when we start taking out key functional groups, microbes in our soil? And there isn't any such thing on this planet as an independent organism. Every species needs other species in order to survive. And a simplified system then, by definition, really becomes a dysfunctional system. We start pulling key groups out, things just won't work. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the human gut, the animal gut, or the soil. And the problem is in agriculture that, in our food production system, I suppose, everything has become so incredibly simplified. The standard American diet, SAD diet, SAD diet, people consume about 5 different things, really, on a daily basis. And how many of you in this room have the same thing for breakfast every day? It may well be a nice homemade muesli with 10 different grains in it that are all organic, and you might have some wonderful lactobacillus-rich yogurt with it and maybe chop up an organic banana or something and put it on top, and it's all absolutely delicious. I'm not saying it's not a great breakfast, but I'll bet you had the same one the next day and the next day and the next day. So we all tend to get into these habits of eating the same things over and over again. And people who don't think about their food, who are happy just to go and have some takeaway, will just tend to keep having the same takeaways over and over and over again. I'm amazed, actually, that anybody's still alive. Really. No, truly. When you look at what people buy in the supermarket and then what people buy, you know, for their meals, and they just keep eating, I mean, and then when you realise how important diversity of food is for diversity of our gut microbiome, and that our gut microbiome is running us, I mean, I guess we're probably like our soils, right? We are just going. We are just going. And there is hope that we can restore our systems. But I think that people today a lot of people don't actually know what it feels like to be healthy. And when you look back to, you know, tribal life, if we look at Australian Aborigines, which is probably something I know a lot more about than Indigenous cultures here, but Aboriginal people prior to European settlement were absolutely extraordinarily fit and healthy, and some of the footprints that have been found, you know, in like when mud's been, like there's been sediment coming over the top of it, preserved human footprints where people have been running, chasing something, and they've been able to analyse from the footprint how fast those people were running. They were running faster than our Olympic athletes run today. You know, and there's lots of these kind of evidence comes from cultures in the days when Aboriginal people had the opportunity to consume 5,000 different food plants. That's a lot. Obviously not everybody did eat 5,000, but I mean that there are something like, I think, 24,000 edible plants in the world, and the standard American diet is 5. Like, we have really oversimplified. So in addition to the fact that there's not much nutrient in the food, in addition to the fact that it's loaded with chemical residues because farmers have been put in the situation of having to apply those things because the plants also don't have an effective immune system, we now find we're hugely limiting the number of different things that we eat. So it's another factor that's often not considered in that equation. So many of our current health issues are actually linked to a failure to support a diversity of microbes in the human gut. And this became very clear in the findings of the American Gut Project. This was a citizen science project where, in order to participate, you paid $98, you received a kit in the mail, they had instructions on what you needed to do. So it just took a week. Every single thing that you consumed during that week you wrote down in a food diary. And every morning when you got up, you kept a record, you made a record of how you felt. How did I feel today? Did I jump out of bed going, oh, well, I'm going to change the world today, I'm feeling absolutely wonderful? Or, geez, I wish I could go back to bed. Or did you have something specific like a headache, or were you feeling nauseous? Are you suffering from any kind of illness? So you filled in like as much information you could about your health and how you were feeling, and also how you're feeling mentally. You know, like, am I feeling depressed? Am I feeling bright and sparky? And at the end of the week, you collected a faecal sample, put it in a special container, sent it off in the mail, went to the laboratory, and they tested it to see what was actually in your gut microbiome. And then you received a report that came back saying, these are the classes of bacteria and fungi and protists and things that you have in your gut, which probably means nothing to an individual. But what they did was there was 11,000 people participated in this project. So that's big. Most medical research involves, you know, at the most hundreds of people. Like, it's very, very expensive to undertake medical research. So 11,000 people. What they found by analysing that data, anonymously of course, was that the people who consumed 30 or more different kinds of plant foods in a week had very diverse gut microbiomes. They had long lists of everything that lived in their gut and were very healthy. They didn't suffer from any of those autoimmune disorders that I listed up there earlier. They woke up feeling great in the morning. They were very positive about their lives. They were happy, joyful people. That's what we should be, right? And they were eating a wide diversity of foods. It didn't matter how much meat they ate.
they could eat heaps and heaps of meat as long as they also had lots and lots of different kinds of plant foods to go with it, and as long as the meat did not come from a confined animal feeding operation. Because if it did, it would have been loaded with antibiotics, and they found that the people who were eating meat from confined animal feeding operations had the same gut profile as people who were on a course of antibiotics. So if you were taking any medication during that week, you also noted that. So the people who were on antibiotics, of course, had a very reduced gut flora. People who were eating meat from confined animal feeding operations had a similarly reduced gut flora. So antibiotics given to animals in those situations are in the meat. There's also been evidence to suggest that the manure from those operations results in those antibiotics also getting into plants that are grown using that manure. So they're very persistent in the environment, and we have lots of issues now with antibiotic resistance, and I think in this country there's more antibiotics given to animals in confined feeding operations than there are administered to people. So that's a worry. So it didn't matter how much meat you ate, but please eat grass-fed, pastured. I'm sure you've got there's some grass-fed cattle operators in here. So the people who ate 10 or less different kinds of plant foods were the ones that were suffering mostly from the autoimmune disorders that is now one of the big issues in health and human health. So Fred Provenza, Professor Fred Provenza, I'm sure many of you in this room would be familiar with him. He has been just an amazing person who's spent his lifetime devoted to how animals select what they eat and what effect that actually has on their function as well. So Fred has looked at the effect of animals consuming a diet rich in secondary plant compounds. So these secondary plant compounds are your polyphenols and your bioflavonoids and your carotenoids and your anthocyanins. And in our situation, like with people, if you want to select foods that are high in those things, they're often the coloured foods, like blueberries and things like that, for example, which is why, they talk about like the rainbow salad, having all those different colours, reds, oranges, blues. Often they're linked to very high levels or to good levels of secondary plant compounds. From a ruminant perspective, something like grass is very low in secondary plant compounds. So it's all the non-grass things, it's the flowers. Think that if you think about what the prairies and the rangelands were like 200 years ago, there really weren't that many grasses there. It's interesting that we think that they were grasslands. They probably had 10 to 15% grasses, and the other things were all what we call dicots or herbs, or they should have been called herblands. So if you go to some areas of the United States that are still representative of what used to be there, in springtime, it's just an absolute mass of flowers with very few grasses. And Australian grasslands were the same. And we shouldn't have called them grasslands. The first Europeans to see Australia talked about carpets of colourful wildflowers. Everywhere they went, the carpets of colourful wildflowers. Well, what do you think sheep and cows do when they're exposed to that situation? They've got flowers to eat, and they've got grasses to eat. They eat the flowers. Have you ever had a cow get into your garden? They love flowers. So, of course, when cattle were introduced, and bison actually, interestingly, prefer to eat grasses. So there was lots and lots of flowering plants. And the bison were concentrating on the grasses. Then when we introduced cattle, they demolished the flowers. So, any areas that have been grazed by cattle for a long time, you don't find many flowers in them these days. But lots of grasses. So grasses have increased because they've been much more grazing tolerant. But it's the flowers, it's the non-grasses that are high in the secondary plant compounds. And those secondary plant compounds are important for microbial diversity in the gut. Livestock just consuming grass don't really have very diverse guts, if I can put it that way. They don't have much microbial diversity in their intestines. Let me just be a little bit more careful about my words there. So when there is a greater range of secondary plant compounds, animals can digest food so much better. Their feed conversion efficiency is much higher, and that's important if you're a livestock producer. That means 1 pound of forage is going to convert to more pounds of beef or milk or wool or whatever it might be that you're producing, and 1 pound of grass is not going to convert to anywhere near as much as 1 pound of forage that's high in secondary plant compounds. So what we find, I thought that's really exciting in the cropping areas where farmers are putting multi-species forages in between cash crops and introducing livestock, those animals are gaining incredible amounts of weight. So and they're very, very healthy. So it's building soil by having a diversity of plants. It's really great for the animals that are consuming those diverse forages. And we're seeing, as I said, incredible weight gains, and that's because of that feed conversion efficiency function. So it's important for many reasons for animals to have a diverse intake of plants, and that is going to improve their immune function as well. So let's look at the plants themselves. The susceptibility to plants and diseases and poor plant productivity, all these things that farmers are experiencing with their plants is also linked to low diversity in the soil microbiome. All living systems are governed to some extent by diversity. And our agricultural landscapes have become so simplified that we're not even aware, actually, most of us are not aware of how productive a more diverse system can be. So this next session where we're going to break out into groups, and your expertise and your experience and knowledge and wisdom and everything is going to be coming out in these groups of what ways in this region, with your resources and your environment and the people that you have here and the enterprises that you have, what can you do to increase the diversity in your systems here? So that is the question for this next slide of discussion that you're going to have with, the production systems that you have, what's available to you, how can you diversify them as much as possible?